Bay 29th Street, Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, 7:45 in the evening. The light is fading, and the street is quiet. A large man steps out of his front door and moves toward the car sitting in his driveway. He's 47 years old, 6'3", built like someone who has never, not once in his life, backed down from a confrontation. For more than a decade, his name has carried real weight in New York organized crime. Not the kind of weight you get from having a title. The kind you earn by being the last man standing after everyone around you either got arrested, got flipped, or got buried. He survived things that ended other men. Shootings, grand jury subpoenas, the kind of internal mob politics where loyalty shifts overnight and the wrong association gets you killed before breakfast. He killed for his boss. He took bullets for his boss. He drove his boss through the streets of New York for years, while FBI surveillance teams burned through film, documenting every move from the windows of parked vans. He was 6 feet from his car when he heard footsteps behind him. He never heard what came next. Frank Lestorino stepped out of the darkness with a .380 automatic and emptied the magazine. 2 shots to the head, 5 to the body, 7 rounds total. Bobby Boriello dropped next to his own car, on his own street, in front of his own house, and bled out on the asphalt, while his 2-year-old son sat in the kitchen and his wife, Susan, ran out the front door screaming. Paramedics responded in minutes. There was nothing to be done. Bobby Boriello was pronounced dead at the scene. But here's what nobody understood that night, and what the newspapers got completely wrong for years afterward. This wasn't Gotti cleaning house. This wasn't a boss eliminating someone who knew too much. The truth was darker, more sinister, and it involved something that had never happened before in the entire history of American organized crime. A mob hit, scouted and set up by 2 active-duty New York City Police Department detectives who were on an enemy family's payroll. This is the story of Bobby Boriello, the man who stood closest to the most powerful boss in the country and was destroyed because of it. To understand how Bobby ended up face down on that driveway, you have to go back to where he came from. He was born on March 31st, 1944, in South Brooklyn. Not the Brooklyn people visit today for brunch and rooftop bars. The Brooklyn of the mid-40s was a place where organized crime didn't operate in the shadows. It operated in the open because it ran the neighborhood. The Gambinos, the Genovese, the Colombos. All of them rooted in the same blocks, the same churches, the same social clubs where the real decisions got made. A kid growing up in that environment in the 1950s didn't need anyone to explain what power looked like. He saw it every day. Men with money, men with respect, men who walked down the street and made other men step aside. Bobby saw all of it up close. His younger brother, Stevie, ran with the Gallo crew. Joey Gallo, Crazy Joe, and the network of rackets they controlled out of Carroll Gardens and Red Hook. These were violent men, serious men, and Bobby, the bigger and more physically imposing of the 2 brothers, naturally gravitated toward the enforcer's role. He was feared on the street before he was formally connected to anyone. By his early 20s, he was muscle for the Gallo operation. Between 1967 and 1972, he was arrested 6 times. Weapons, assault, larceny, gambling. The police knew exactly who he was and what he was doing. But knowing and proving are 2 very different things in Brooklyn. And Bobby kept walking out of precinct houses and back onto the street. When Crazy Joe Gallo was murdered at Umberto's Clam House in April of 1972, the crew started to fracture. Stevie held together what rackets he could. Bobby, meanwhile, was drifting toward a bigger orbit entirely. The Gambino family, the most powerful organized crime operation in the United States. The man who would change the direction of Bobby's life was coming up through the same streets at the same time. John Gotti was running operations out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens. He was sharp. He dressed like money. He rewarded loyalty without hesitation, and he punished betrayal without mercy. He ran his crew with a discipline that commanded respect, even from men who didn't like him. And sometime in the late 1970s, as Gotti standing inside the Gambino family climbed, Bobby Boriello became his man. Not just an associate. Not just a soldier orbiting the boss from a distance. Bobby became Gotti's driver. His bodyguard. The man in the front seat. The man who got out first when the car stopped. and put himself between the boss and whatever was waiting on the other side of that door. In organized crime, that role carries an unspoken weight that no title can capture. You are trusted completely, or you are replaced immediately. You know everything, because you are everywhere. And your fate becomes permanently tied to the bosses, in ways that cannot be undone by a conversation or a reassignment. Bobby and Gotti were together constantly. Weekends on Long Island. Gambling. Shows. The FBI surveillance teams who spent years photographing the Gambino family's movements captured them together dozens of times. Bobby wasn't an employee. He was, in every real sense of the word, a friend. In December of 1988, he was formally inducted as a made member of the Gambino crime family. The ceremony took place on Christmas Eve in a Manhattan apartment. The room that night read like a Gambino who's who. John Gotti Jr., Dominic Pizzonia, Craig DePalma, and others. The oath was administered by Sammy, the Bull Gravano, and Pasquale Conti. Being made in the Gambino family in 1988, with Gotti at the top, meant you had arrived at the absolute center of American organized crime. Here's how Bobby actually worked. His crew ran trucking, construction, and loan sharking across Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island, and South Brooklyn. He had serious men around him. The operation had a significant stake in strip clubs along the East Coast, through a fixer named Steve Kaplan, who paid tribute to both Bobby and Junior Gotti for the right to operate without interference. Bobby was aggressive about protecting what he'd built. On one occasion, he opened fire on a Genovese associate named Preston Geritano, in broad daylight, on a Brooklyn street. That kind of recklessness would have gotten most men killed immediately. But Bobby had enough standing with Gotti that the two families negotiated a settlement, instead of going to war. Then came October 4th, 1990. Gotti had a problem. A Gambino soldier named Louis Dono had landed a contract to install fireproofing on the infrastructure of the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center. Serious money. And Dono had been dodging Gotti's summons, refusing to come in and account for himself. In the world Bobby lived in, that kind of disrespect has exactly one resolution. Gotti gave the contract to Bobby. Bobby carried it out. Louis Dono was shot dead in a parking garage at the World Trade Center that October. Sammy Gravano absorbed the construction operation. The machine worked exactly as designed. One man disappears. The money moves. Nobody asks questions. By late 1990, Bobby had been elevated to acting capo of Junior Gotti's crew. He was running his operation out of a Brooklyn social club on Sackett Street. He was one of the most powerful men in the family. And then, in December 1990, Gotti himself was indicted on federal charges and taken off the street. A five-man panel was assembled to run the Gambino family while the boss fought his case. Junior Gotti was on that panel. Bobby, as acting capo, held real operational authority inside a suddenly leaderless crime organization. On the surface, this was the peak. 47 years old. Made capo in the most powerful mob family in America. Gotti's personal protector, now elevated to one of the family's senior decision-makers. But underneath all of that, the ground was already moving. To understand what came next, you have to go back 5 years. December 16, 1985. Outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, in Midtown Manhattan. Gambino boss Paul Castellano and his underboss Tommy Bellotti were shot dead on the sidewalk. The hit was Gotti's work. Bold, brilliant, and completely unsanctioned. No commission vote. No approval from the other families. Gotti killed the boss and took the throne because he decided he could. A Gambino informant later placed Bobby Boriello at the scene of the Castellano operation. That detail mattered enormously, because the Lucchese family had been closely aligned with Castellano for years. And the Lucchese underboss, Anthony Gaspipe, Casso, was not a man who forgot where a bullet came from. Casso kept a mental ledger. Every slight, every act of aggression, every name connected to something he considered an offense. Bobby Boriello's name was in that ledger, and it had been there since 1985. Now, you need to understand who Casso really was. Anthony Casso grew up on the same streets as Bobby. Same neighborhood, same world. And by the 1980s, he had become the most dangerous man in the entire New York mob. He ordered murders the way other men made phone calls. He was eventually charged with 15 homicides, pled guilty to racketeering and extortion while cooperating with the government, and prosecutors estimated his actual body count was somewhere close to 100. Casso didn't want to win his wars. He wanted the other side to stop existing entirely. And Casso had something that no one else in the mob had ever had. Two of them, actually. Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa were active-duty detectives with the New York City Police Department. Ippolito was physically imposing, a former bodybuilder who had actually written a book about his own family's mob connections. Caracappa was quieter, more methodical, the kind of investigator who built his career inside major case squads, tracking organized crime homicides. Both men, by any external measure, were serious law enforcement officers. Both men were also on Gaspipe Casso's payroll, for $1,000 a month, each. Starting around 1986, Ippolito and Caracappa began feeding Casso confidential NYPD intelligence. Files, informant identities, home addresses, vehicle registrations. They functioned like a military reconnaissance unit. Find the target, confirm the location, let the shooters do the rest. Multiple murders were facilitated through that arrangement, and nobody on the outside had any idea. By early 1991, Casso had made his decision about Bobby Boriello. The trigger was a recording. Ippolito and Caracappa had provided Casso with an audio tape, on which Bobby could be heard making explicit threats against Casso and his family. How that recording was obtained is disputed. What was on it was not. Bobby had said things on that tape that Casso treated as a formal death sentence. But before the shooter was ever dispatched, there was one step that needed to happen first. The address had to be confirmed. Ippolito took that on personally. He drove to Bay 29th Street in Bensonhurst. In uniform, he knocked on the front door. Susan Boriello answered. She described it years later, in detail. A large detective pulled his jacket back to show his badge and his weapon. He asked whether Bobby Boriello lived at that address. She told him her husband wasn't home. He said he'd come back. He got in his car and drove away. He never came back, because he already had everything he needed. The address was confirmed. The information was delivered to Casso. The contract went to Lucchese Captain Frank Lino, a man described in federal court documents as efficient, precise, and without hesitation. He did not miss. April 13, 1991. Bobby had spent the afternoon at Aqueduct Racetrack. He came home as the sun was going down. Susan was inside the kitchen with their 2-year-old son. Their 11-year-old was out at the movies. Bobby stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. Lino stepped out of the shadows. 7 rounds. Twice in the head. 5 in the torso. Bobby Boriello went down next to his Lincoln Town car, and he didn't get up. Susan heard what she thought was the same old argument with the neighbor about the driveway, a fight that had played out a dozen times before. She stepped outside. She saw her husband face down on the asphalt. She grabbed the baby. She called 911. She collapsed when the officers told her he was gone. Gotti got the news in jail. He was furious. He sent word through channels that Stevie Boriello, Bobby's brother, had the full backing of the Gambino family to pursue retaliation. He also ordered a sit-down with the Genovese family over Geritano, the man Bobby had shot at years earlier. Gotti wanted every loose end accounted for. But for 14 years, nobody could tell Susan Boriello who had actually given the order, or how they had known exactly where Bobby would be standing that night. March 2005. DEA and FBI agents arrested Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa in Las Vegas, where both men had retired and were living comfortable lives. The federal indictment was one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of American law enforcement. 8 murders, 2 attempted murders, conspiracy, obstruction, drug distribution, money laundering. 2 detectives, who had sworn to protect the people of New York City, had spent the better part of a decade functioning as contract operatives for the Lucchese crime family. Bobby Boriello's murder was named in the original indictment. Prosecutors laid out, in precise detail, how Ippolito and Caracappa had confirmed his address and delivered the intelligence that put the contract in motion. The Boriello count was ultimately trimmed from the charges taken to trial. But the evidence of the 2 detectives' role in setting up the hit was preserved in federal court filings and confirmed by multiple cooperating witnesses. Susan Boriello found out the truth in 2005, 14 years after she buried her husband, when she saw Ippolito's photograph in a newspaper. She recognized him instantly. The large detective who had knocked on her door, shown his badge, and asked if her husband was home. She called the prosecutors the same day. Her father, who had been at the house the night Bobby was killed and had been interviewed by investigators at the scene, recognized Caracappa as one of the detectives who had questioned him that night. The men who came to investigate the murder had helped arrange it. Eppolito and Caracappa were convicted on all counts in 2006. A federal judge sentenced both men to life in prison, plus 80 years, and fined each of them more than $4 million. Anthony Gaspipe Casso had turned federal informant in 1994. He eventually pled guilty to 70 separate crimes, including racketeering, extortion, and 15 murders. A judge sentenced him to 455 years in prison. He died in federal custody on December 15, 2020. Frank Lino, the man who pulled the triggers 7 times on that Bensonhurst driveway, pled guilty to multiple murders and racketeering charges. Stevie Boriello, Bobby's brother, remained active in the Gambino family across Brooklyn and Staten Island for years after his brother's death. John Gotti was convicted on April 2, 1992. 5 murders, conspiracy, racketeering, tax evasion, extortion. He received a life sentence, with no possibility of parole. He was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1998 and died at a federal medical center in Springfield, Missouri, on June 10, 2002. He never walked free again. Bobby Boriello was 47 years old. He had given the better part of his life to a man and to a world that operated on one rule above all others. Loyalty is everything. Until it isn't. He was loyal to the end. The end found him anyway.